A cold mist rolled over the damp fields as the evening bells tolled, their slow, hollow chime echoing across a village that felt both alive and haunted. It was the year when fear ruled more than kings, when sickness was whispered about more than prayers were spoken. In the far corner of Europe, behind mossy stone walls and weathered wooden gates, there were places few dared to look at directly, places spoken of only at night, when the hearth was low and the candles flickered. They called them leper houses, or more harshly, leper colonies. To most, they were just shadowed names in a sermon or a warning told to children. Do not go near the fields beyond the road, for that is where the afflicted dwell. On a gray road that led nowhere important, a small cart creaked under the weight of bread loaves wrapped in rough linen. Beside it walked a young man named Elias, no older than 20, his hands chapped from the early autumn wind. He was not a doctor, nor a priest, only the son of a baker who had been asked, gently but firmly, by the village to deliver food to the outskirts. It was said that once a week someone must go, or else misfortune might find them all. He had heard the stories, men ringing little bells to warn of their approach, women hiding their faces under cloth, and children who vanished from the church steps and were never spoken of again. But no one ever explained why the leper colony was so far from the village, or what truly happened behind its walls. The road felt longer than it was, not because of the distance, but because of the quiet. The fields that had once been full of workers were empty, and the crows seemed louder than usual. There were no songs from a mill, no chatter from the stream, only the sound of his own boots in the mud. Somewhere in the distance, a wooden cross leaned to one side, marking the path that no villager wished to travel. Elias swallowed hard, remembering his mother's words before he left. Do not look them in the eye, do not take their hand, and do not linger. Leave the bread and return before the shadows stretch too long. The leper houses of medieval Europe were not places of healing. They were places of waiting. Waiting for the body to change, for the world to forget, for the seasons to pass until only the memory remained. Some were built by kings, others by monks, but many were simply abandoned barns or ruined manors, turned into shelters for those the world no longer wished to see. In some places, the afflicted were given a bell to ring, a cloak to cover their skin, and a small wooden cross to carry. In others, they were left to fend for themselves, their only company the cold wind and the slow decay of their own bodies. As Elias reached the first gate, his breath caught in his chest. It was not what he had imagined. There were no guards, no priests waiting with lanterns, no chance of warning. Only an old rope tied to a post, a thin curtain of mist, and beyond it, the faint outline of huts crouched against the hillside. The air smelled faintly of smoke, but also of something else, something metallic like rain on rusted iron. He set the basket down and stepped back, as his father had told him. He was to leave it and go. That was the rule. But something in the silence made him pause. There, in the corner of his eye, he saw a movement, a shadow shifting behind a broken fence. Then a bell, soft, distant, like a sheep wandering too far from the flock. It was not threatening, only strange. And then he heard it, a voice, low, careful, as if unused to speaking with strangers. Bread for us. Elias froze. The voice was neither young nor old, neither man nor woman, but something in it carried a weight that made the hairs on his neck rise. The stories of leper colonies often spoke of punishment, how these people were marked for their sins, cursed by God or by fate. But standing there, Elias felt none of that. He felt only the pull of a place where time had slowed, where the world had turned its back. And yet, he also felt something else, a presence, as if the colony itself was watching him, waiting for him to decide whether to turn away like the others or to step closer, just enough to see what lay behind the mist. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint ring of laughter or perhaps a cough. Elias's fingers tightened around the cart handle. He wanted to leave. He wanted to run. But the path behind him seemed longer than before, and the path ahead, it was as though it had been waiting for him. In the farthest hut, a small lantern flickered to life. Then another, and then, like stars waking one by one, the colony began to glow. The unsettling history of these places was not written in grand chronicles. It was written in the forgotten corners of Europe, in letters never sent, in prayers never answered. They were places of fear, yes, but also of resilience. Some who lived there found a strange kind of peace away from the scorn of the world. Others did not live long enough to find anything at all. And still, the bells would ring, the bread would be left, and the villagers would sleep a little easier, pretending that nothing more needed to be done. Elias took one hesitant step forward. The mist curled around his ankles like cold fingers. "Who is there?" he asked, his voice unsteady. From the shadow of the gate, a figure emerged, not close enough to see, only close enough to know that someone had heard him. There was no threat in the figure's stance, only a kind of quiet waiting. "Leave it by the post," the voice said again, this time clearer, softer. But behind those words, there was something else, something like a question, or perhaps a plea. As the night deepened, the village bell tolled once more, far in the distance. Elias knew he should leave. The bread was delivered, the duty fulfilled. But the colony was no longer just a name, no longer just a warning in the dark. It was real, and it was waiting. He felt the weight of the road, the cold of the air, and the eyes. He could feel them now, watching from the mist. And somewhere beyond those dim lanterns, deeper in the colony where the air grew stiller and the bells rang no more, something stirred. Would Elias walk away as his father had always done, or would he take that one forbidden step inside? The night offered no answer. Only the silence, the mist, and the faint, lingering chime of a bell that did not sound like warning anymore. It sounded like invitation. The lantern in the distance swayed gently, casting its dim glow on the damp earth, and Elias could not tell if the wind moved it or if a hand held it. His breath formed soft clouds in the cool night air, each one fading before it could reach the gate. He thought of the stories his grandfather used to tell by the fire, about men who ventured too close to the leper colonies and came back with nothing but silence in their eyes. But those were old tales, and sometimes old tales were only shadows of fear that lingered too long. Still, his heart beat faster, and his feet stayed rooted where they were. The voice had come from the shadows again, low and uneven, as if the speaker had not spoken much for many days. "Leave it, boy," it said. Elias's fingers brushed the handle of the basket. The linen wrapping had begun to dampen from mist. He wanted to ask their name, to see their face, to know if they were like the stories said, covered in rags, faces hidden, fingers lost to sickness. But the words caught in his throat. There was something human in the way the voice trembled, something tired, something that asked for nothing more than bread and a little kindness. In medieval Europe, such places were rarely visited. Lepers were often sent away, given a small allowance or a field that nobody wanted, and told to make do. Some colonies were near rivers, where the land was cheap and the damp air carried the smell of sickness away from the villages. Others were by crossroads, marked by rough stone crosses, so travelers would know to keep their distance. The fear of contagion was strong. Few truly understood the disease, but many believed even the air could carry it. And so, bells were given, so the afflicted could warn the healthy of their approach, and cloaks with long hoods were worn, so their faces would not startle the unprepared. Elias remembered the last winter, when the snow piled high and food ran low. There had been whispers in the village tavern that some of the lepers had died in their huts, and no one had gone to bury them until the thaw. He had imagined them then as ghosts with skin like parchment, wandering through the trees, waiting for the ground to soften. Now, standing before the gate, he felt the weight of those whispers pressing on his shoulders. From a mist, the figure stepped closer. The lantern's glow caught a fragment of cloth, a sleeve, torn and patched, the color faded to gray. The figure kept their hood low, their face turned slightly away. "We thank you," the voice said again. It was softer now, almost warm. "The winter will come early this year." Elias did not know what to say. He nodded, though he was not sure the figure could see him through the mist. His hand lingered on the basket a moment longer, then let go. The bread was theirs now. He had done what was asked of him. But as he turned to leave, the figure spoke again. "Tell them in the village. The wind carries more than snow this year. The words puzzled him. He looked back, but the figure had already stepped into the mist, and the lantern's glow faded as if swallowed by the fog. The road home felt longer than the road here. Each tree seemed to lean a little closer, each crow a little louder. The bells from the colony rang faintly behind him, a sound that was neither mournful nor joyful, only present, like a memory that would not leave. Elias tried to shake it off. He told himself it was only a place for the sick, nothing more. But deep down, he wondered what life must be like behind that gate. Did they laugh? Did they pray? Did they still hope for the day they might walk freely among the healthy again? In the villages of that time, lepers were often remembered not by their names, but by their absence. They became the ones over there, people seen only in glimpses and spoken of in hushed tones. And yet, many had been fathers, mothers, brothers, daughters, merchants who had once walked the market square, farmers who had once tilled the same fields Elias now crossed. Some had even been noble, stripped of their lands, and sent away when the first signs appeared. It was said that a touch of white on the skin, a numbness in the hands, a strange ache that would not leave, these were the signs that your life was about to change forever. The moon slipped from behind the clouds as Elias reached the stone cross that marked the safe road. He glanced back once more. The mist still clung to the hills, hiding the huts, the gate, and the figure with the lantern. But he could feel their eyes, all of them, following him until he was gone. That night, sleep did not come easily. He lay by the fire, listening to the crackle of wood and the faint sounds of the village outside, the barking of a dog, the distant rush of the river. But beneath it all, he thought he heard bells. Soft, irregular, like a heartbeat that was not his own. He dreamed of the mist, of the figure, of the words. The wind carries more than snow this year. Days passed, and the village continued its life as though nothing had happened. The market bustled, the church bells rang, the fields were turned for the coming frost. But Elias could not shake the feeling that something lingered beyond the gate. There were fewer travelers on the road now, and the elders spoke more often of bad air, of strange chills, of prayers that needed saying. Some said the leper colony was growing. New huts built in the night, new faces seen in the fog. Others said it was emptying, that the bells rang for funerals now, not for warning. No one knew for sure, because no one went near except to leave bread and return. Then one evening, the same request came again. "It is your turn," his father said, his face unreadable. The villagers nodded their agreement. The cart was ready. The bread was wrapped. The mist, they said, would be thick tonight. Elias felt the same chill in his stomach as before, the same pull of that distant place. But this time, he thought of the figure with the lantern, of the warning that had sounded like more than just a passing remark. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the cold crept in, he took the road once more. The cross stood in its place, the path winding into the gray. Somewhere beyond it, the bells would ring, and the colony would wake. The evening wind pressed against Elias's cloak as he trudged onward, his boots sinking into the damp road that wound like a ribbon between empty fields. The sky was a washed-out gray, the kind that promised frost before dawn. He could feel the cold creeping in through the seams of his clothes, but it was not the chill that troubled him most. It was the silence, the heavy, expectant silence that seemed to grow thicker the closer he drew to the gate. This was his second journey now, and though his steps followed the same path, the road felt changed. The hedges that lined the way leaned darker than before. The stones seemed more uneven, and the trees whispered among themselves in the wind. Somewhere ahead, just beyond the line where the world turned to mist, the colony waited. In his hands, the basket felt heavier than it should have. There was more bread this time, a few dried apples, even a small pouch of salt, for their sores. One of the women in the village had said, though her voice carried little warmth. They spoke of charity because they must, not because they wished to. Lepers, after all, were not entirely forgotten, but neither were they truly remembered. As Elias neared the gate, the first bell rang. Soft, distant, almost like before. Yet this time he noticed something different. The sound did not drift from one place. It echoed from several, as though more than one bell was calling out into the dusk. He paused, his breath clouding before him, and scanned the shadows. The huts were still vague shapes in the fog, their thatched roofs sagging beneath the weight of damp air. But there were more lanterns now, 4, perhaps 5, scattered like fallen stars. In medieval Europe, leper colonies were often built at the edge of villages or just beyond the town walls. They were not prisons in the strictest sense, yet most who entered rarely left. The people there were bound by law and by fear. They could not wander freely, could not work in the markets, could not kneel beside their neighbors in church without drawing whispers. Some colonies had chapels where priests said mass for them, though the priests kept their distance and cleansed their hands twice. Others had nothing but rough benches and the open sky. Elias set the basket by the post as he had before, but this time he did not step away immediately. His eyes searched for the figure with the lantern, the one who had spoken to him nights ago. The mist thickened and thinned like breath, and then, slowly, a shadow emerged. The same hood, the same patchwork sleeve. They came closer, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw a pale shape beneath the hood, cheekbones too sharp, lips dry from the cold. But the figure turned aside, keeping their face in the dark. "You returned," the voice said, and this time it carried something new. Relief, perhaps, or recognition. "I brought more than bread," Elias answered quietly. His voice sounded strange in the heavy air, as though it belonged to someone older, someone who had walked this road many times. "There's salt and apples." A pause, then a soft chuckle, dry, almost brittle. "The salt will help. It keeps the sores from festering. The apples, they will make the children smile." The words caught him. Children. He had not imagined children in the colony. In the stories, the lepers were always old, their backs bent, their faces hidden. Yet now he pictured small hands reaching for the apples, small eyes glinting in the gloom. He wanted to ask their names, to ask how many they were, to ask if the winter would be as hard as the voice had warned. But the words tangled with his breath. Instead, he said, "You spoke of the wind before. What did you mean?" The figure was silent for a long moment. The lantern light swayed, and behind them, more shapes shifted in the fog. 2, perhaps 3, watching from a distance. "The sickness changes with the season," the voice said at last. "When the frost comes early, the sores spread faster. The cold slows the body, and the spirit follows." There was no anger in the words, only a weary truth. The bells rang again, this time closer, and Elias stepped back without meaning to. He felt the weight of many eyes now. Men, women, perhaps those children the voice had spoken of, all hidden, all waiting just beyond the mist. The village had always spoken of them as if they were already gone, but here they were, breathing, watching, surviving. In some places, it was said that lepers would gather at the edges of markets, begging for scraps with wooden rattles to announce their presence. Others lived in rough houses built by monks, where they prayed each day for mercy, though mercy rarely came. The church allowed them burial in consecrated ground if they confessed and if someone dared to carry their bodies. Some leper colonies even had their own graveyards, small fields of unmarked earth where the wind spoke the names no one else would. The figure lifted the basket, then, careful with their hands, gloved, Elias noticed now, though the cloth was thin and patched. "We will remember this," they said, almost as if making a promise. "Few from the village come twice." "I might come again," Elias found himself saying, though he had not meant to. The words felt like a thread tugged from somewhere he did not see. The lantern lowered. The mist stirred. "If you do, come before the snow," the voice murmured. "After the snow, it will not be the same." The words followed him all the way back down the road. He thought of them as he crossed the stone cross, as he passed the empty fields, as the dark village roofs rose before him. The wind nipped at his ears, but it was not the cold that made his steps quicken. It was the feeling that something was changing, something the villagers did not yet speak of. That night, as he lay by the fire, he tried to listen only to the crackle of the logs. But in the quiet, he heard the bells again, faint, steady, as though the colony had not slept at all. The morning that followed was gray and damp, the kind of morning when the sun never truly broke through the clouds. Elias rose before the rest of the house, his hands still cold from sleep, and stepped outside to the smell of wet earth. The village was waking slowly, smoke rising from low chimneys, chickens stirring in their coops, and a dog barking somewhere near the stream. But his eyes kept drifting to the far line of trees, where the road curved toward the colony. It was too early for bells, yet he felt them in his chest, as if they had rung through his dreams all night long. At the bakery, his father worked the dough with quiet strength. Flour dusted his beard and sleeves, and the fire roared in the oven's mouth. "You didn't speak much last night," his father said without looking up. "Did they take the bread?" "They did," Elias replied, tying his apron. "They said the salt would help." He hesitated, then added, "There are children there." The older man paused for a moment, his hands resting on the dough. "There are always children," he said, almost to himself. "That is why we leave the bread, so they don't starve." But his tone held no softness. It was the tone of a man who had learned to live beside an ache without letting it move him. All day, Elias worked among the heat and the smell of yeast, yet his thoughts wandered. Who were the children? Did they play? Did they know what waited for them? The village never spoke of names, never told stories of who had gone there. It was as if the colony swallowed not only people, but their histories as well. That evening, at the gathering hall, the elders spoke in low voices. Winter, they said, was creeping in faster this year. Travelers from the north had brought tales of harsh winds and failing crops. The leper colony, someone mentioned, had grown again. 2 new huts had been seen on the hillside. There were whispers that the sickness might be spreading closer, that the mist itself carried ill luck. "We will need to send more offerings before the first snow," one of the elders said. "If the colony is fed, perhaps the village will be spared." Elias felt their eyes turn to him for a moment, though no one spoke his name. He was young, strong, and had already gone twice without trouble. That was enough to mark him for a third journey. When the night came, he lay awake, the soft rasp of the wind against the shutters filling the room. He thought of the figure with the lantern, of their words. "After the snow, it will not be the same." What did that mean? Would the colony close its gates forever? Or would something slip past them, carried by the winter air? The next morning, he set out before dawn, a heavier load in his cart this time. Sacks of grain, 2 bundles of firewood, and a jar of honey sealed with wax. The elders said honey was good for wounds. It kept them clean and sweetened the bitter bread. As he walked, the frost cracked beneath his boots, and a pale light spread across the fields. The cross that marked the road to the colony was dusted white now. Its arms rimed with frost. Beyond it, the mist waited as before, a thin veil between his world and theirs. He paused, fingers tied on the cart handle, and listened. At first, only silence. Then, a faint chime, not 1 bell this time, but 2, answering each other like slow heartbeats. He pushed forward. The gate stood open, not wide, but just enough. And for the first time, Elias saw past it. There was a narrow path lined with stones, huts clustered like hunched shoulders, and a chapel with its door ajar. Smoke rose from one chimney, and the faint sound of coughing drifted through the still air. A child stepped out first. Elias stopped where he stood. The child was no older than 8, bundled in a cloak too large for their small frame. Their hands were covered by mittens, and their face was half hidden by a scarf. They looked at him with wide, steady eyes, not fearful, not shy, only curious. "Is that for us?" the child asked. He nodded. "Bread, honey, firewood." The child turned and called into the mist. 2 figures came forward, the hooded one from before, and another, taller, with a wooden staff. The taller one wore a cross around their neck, the wood worn smooth from years of touch. A former monk, Elias guessed, or perhaps a priest who had chosen, or been forced, to live among them. "You return often," the monk said, his voice rough but not unkind. "Not many from your village do." "I was asked to bring these," Elias replied. "The elders said the winter will be harsh." The monk nodded slowly, his eyes glancing at the sky as if reading the clouds. "It will. And harsh winters do not ask who is clean and who is not." The hooded figure stepped closer, taking the basket from the cart. Their movements were slow, careful, as though each step had to be measured. "There is talk in the village," Elias said, before he could stop himself. "They say the colony grows." The monk's expression did not change. "Sickness does not wait for permission," he said simply. "It comes where it will. But we have not asked for more huts. They are built because there are more who need them." The child tugged at the monk's sleeve, whispering something Elias could not hear. The monk nodded, then looked at him again. "You should go before the fog thickens," he advised. "It is not wise to linger." Elias glanced at the open gate, the narrow path leading deeper in. He wanted to see more, how they lived, how they prayed, how they bore the cold when the village pretended they were gone. But the bells rang once more, closer now, and he felt the same pull as before, a mixture of pity, fear, and a strange, quiet curiosity. "I will return," he said, though the words felt heavier this time, almost like a promise. As he turned away, the child called after him, "Bring stories next time." The words followed him down the road, carried by the frost-bitten wind. Stories. Not bread, not salt, not wood stories. He thought of the nights by the hearth, the tales his grandfather told, the songs the children in the village sang. Well, had they last heard a story in that place? The mist thickened behind him, hiding the colony once more. But in his mind, the image lingered. The small child with steady eyes, the monk with his wooden cross, the hooded figure who had spoken of the wind. And somewhere, in the hollow spaces between the bells, a question formed: what was it they truly wanted from him? The frost clung to the trees like white moss as Elias walked home that day, but his thoughts stayed tangled in what he had seen. The open gate, the child with eyes too calm for their years, the monk who spoke like a man who had buried too many winters. These images would not leave him. And that strange request, spoken so simply, almost like a plea: "Bring stories next time." It had been said with hope, not hunger, and that unsettled him more than the bells ever could. In the village, life carried on as though nothing beyond the stone cross existed. Men hauled logs for the coming snow, women spread straw in the stalls, and children played near the well, their laughter sharp against the stillness of the air. Elias moved among them, his hands busy, but his mind elsewhere. He wondered if those children in the colony played the same way, if they still laughed, or if the sound of bells had stolen the joy from their voices. He wondered how long it had been since anyone told him a tale, or sang them a song. That night, by the hearth, he listened to his grandfather's voice rumble through another old story, a tale of saints and miracles, the kind that soothed the fearful heart. But Elias did not hear the words as he once had. His thoughts drifted to the colony again. Did they believe in miracles there? Or had the sickness hollowed that hope away, like frost eating the last green from the fields? In those days, people believed much and feared more. Leprosy was thought by many to be a punishment, a mark of sin upon the flesh. Priests preached that the afflicted bore the weight of their transgressions in their sores, and so the healthy turned from them, lest the stain of sin spread like the sickness itself. And yet, the church also spoke of charity, of pity, of the duty to feed and clothe the forsaken. So the villages gave what they could spare: bread, salt, old cloaks, but always from a distance, always without touching. Because to touch was to risk more than the body. It was to risk the soul. Elias thought of this as he worked through the next day, shaping loaves in silence. He thought of hands gloved in rags, of faces hidden by hoods, of a world behind that gate where life moved slower, quieter, as though winter had settled there long before the snow came. And he thought of that monk, the way his eyes seemed to hold something Elias could not name, a calmness that was not peace, a sorrow that was not despair. When the evening bells tolled for vespers, Elias slipped outside and walked the edge of the fields. The sky was bruised with twilight, and a thin crescent moon hung low over the hills. The air smelled of wood smoke and earth, yet beneath it, faint and distant, he thought he caught another scent, sharp, metallic, like iron left in the rain. He stopped, listening. The village sounds faded behind him. For a moment, All he heard was the wind whispering through the bare branches. And then, so faint he almost doubted it, a bell. Just one note, far away. That night, he dreamed of snow falling over huts and lanterns, of bells ringing like voices calling his name. He woke with his heart pounding and the taste of cold on his tongue. By the third morning, the sky was hard and pale, and the elders spoke again. The snow would come soon, perhaps within the week. More offerings must be sent before the roads closed. You know the way, his father said, his tone flat as the dough he kneaded. Elias said nothing, but the thought of turning back down that misted road filled him with something he could not name, a pull stronger than fear, stronger even than duty. He gathered the provisions, coarse bread, dried beans, another bundle of wood. But this time, almost without thinking, he tucked something else into the cart. A small book of tales, its leather cover worn soft by years of use. His grandfather's stories. If the child wanted stories, then stories he would bring. The road to the colony felt different in the sharp daylight. The mist was thinner now, but the cold bit harder, nipping at his fingers through the wool. Frost rimed the hedges and glittered on the stones, and the bare trees stood like black bones against the sky. As he neared the cross, he slowed. There on the roadside lay a scrap of cloth, a mitten small, gray, stiff with frost. He picked it up, turning in his hand. It was the size of the child's hand, he thought, the one who had asked for stories. He tucked it into his cloak and walked on. The gate was closed when he reached it. Not locked, only drawn to, as if the colony had curled in on itself against the cold. He set down the cart and waited, listening to the stillness. No bells, no voices, only the wind sighing through the trees. He called out softly, "I've brought food, firewood." His breath hung in the air, but no answer came. He waited longer than he meant to, the silence pressing in until it seemed louder than sound. At last, just as he reached for the cart to leave, the gate creaked open. Slowly, a face appeared in the gap. Not the monk, not the hooded figure, but someone else. A woman, perhaps 30, though the sickness had aged her features. Her skin was pale, the color of wax, and her eyes were dark hollows, deep but bright. She did not speak, only looked at him for a long moment before stepping back to let him pass. Elias froze. No one had ever invited him inside. The rule was always the same, leave the bread and go. But the gate stood open now, the woman waiting in the shadows. He thought of the child's mitten in his cloak. He thought of the stories he carried. And before he could stop himself, he stepped forward. The air inside was colder, heavier, though he could not say why. The huts crouched low along the path, their thatched roofs sagging under frost. Smoke curled from one chimney, thin and gray. The ground was hard, rutted with frozen mud. He heard coughing from somewhere, a harsh, tearing sound that made his chest ache just to hear it. A dog limped across the path and vanished into the mist. The woman led him to a low shed near the chapel and gestured for him to leave the cart there. He unloaded the bread, the beans, the firewood. When he reached for the small book in his cloak, her eyes followed his hand. "Stories," he said quietly, unsure why the word felt so strange in his mouth. Her lips curved, almost a smile, though it faded quickly. Then the bells rang. Not one, not two, many, all at once, their tones clashing like voices in panic. Elias spun toward the sound. Figures were moving through the fog now, shapes of men and women, some bent, some limping, all drawn toward the chapel. The bells rang faster, urgent, and a low voice rose above them, chanting words Elias could not catch. The woman touched his arm lightly, her fingers cold even through the cloth. "Stay here," she whispered, and she was gone, swallowed by the mist. Elias stood alone by the shed, the bells hammering in his ears. He clutched the book in his hand like a talisman, his breath coming quick in the biting air. What was happening? A prayer? A warning? Or something else entirely? The wind stirred, carrying with it a sound that was not bells, not voices, but something raw, something like a cry torn from the earth itself. Elias's grip tightened on the book. For the first time, he wished he had not come alone. The bells quieted as suddenly as they had begun, leaving a ringing in Elias's ears that made the silence feel even heavier. The mist seemed to thicken, curling low along the ground as though it too had heard the sound and was now waiting for what would follow. Elias stood there, uncertain, his breath shallow in the cold. He wanted to turn and leave, to push the cart back down the road and return to the life he knew, but his feet did not move. Something held him there, perhaps the memory of the child's plea, or perhaps the strange pull of a place that felt half forgotten by the world. From the chapel door, the monk appeared at last. His robe was darker today, the hood drawn deep, and in his hands he carried a lantern whose light cut only a narrow path through the gray. His gaze found Elias, and though his face was shadowed, his voice carried clear. "You brought them," he said, almost more to himself than to Elias. Then he nodded once and gestured. "Come." Elias hesitated, clutching the book. "The food, the wood, they are in the shed." "I know," the monk replied, "but you brought more than food." The word sent a chill through Elias. He glanced at the huts, where faint shapes lingered at the windows, watching. A child's silhouette flashed past a curtain. Somewhere nearby, someone coughed again, low and rasping. The monk turned without another word, his lantern bobbing as he walked toward the chapel. Elias followed, his boots crunching in the frost. Inside, the chapel was dim and smelled of smoke and herbs. Sharp, almost bitter. Candles burned along the altar, their flames steady despite the draft that whispered through the wooden beams. A handful of figures knelt in the pews, their heads bowed, faces hidden in shadow. The air was warmer here, but close, heavy with the scent of wax and damp wool. The monk set the lantern down and faced him. "What is your name?" "Elias." "Elias," the monk repeated, tasting the name like something long forgotten. "You have come twice now. Few do. Fewer still come willingly." Elias shifted, unsure whether that was a compliment or a warning. "I only bring what is asked. Bread, wood, and words," the monk added, his gaze dropping to the book in Elias's hands. "The boy told me." "You mean the child at the gate?" The monk nodded slowly. "He is eager for stories. They all are. It has been long since they heard anything but bells and prayers." Elias looked around the chapel again. The kneeling figures did not move, but he could feel their attention on him, thin and stretched like the cold air outside. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why the bells? Why the prayers like that?" The monk's hands tightened on the back of the pew. "Because the sickness does not only touch the skin," he said at last. "It clings to the spirit if you let it. The bells remind them they are still seen, still remembered." Elias thought of the empty road, the frost creeping across the fields, the way the world seemed to turn its face from this place. "Are they?" he asked before he could stop himself. The monk's eyes met his, and for a moment there was no answer, only the faint crackle of candle wicks and the distant wind. Then the monk said, "Come. If you wish to give your stories, give them to those who wait." He led Elias into a small room at the side of the chapel. Here the air was warmer still, and a handful of children sat on straw mats, their faces pale in the lantern light. Some had the marks of the sickness, white patches on the skin, fingers wrapped in cloth, while others seemed untouched, though their eyes held a weight beyond their years. The boy from before was there, clutching the gray mitten Elias had found. He looked up as Elias entered, and a faint smile flickered across his face. "You came back," the boy said. His voice was hoarse but steady. "I said I would," Elias replied, kneeling beside him. "And I brought what I promised." He opened the book, its pages worn soft from many winters. The children leaned closer, their breath mingling in the cold. For a moment, the world outside, the bells, the frost, the coughing, seemed to hold its breath. He began with a simple tale, one of courage and cleverness, the kind his grandfather used to tell by the hearth when the nights grew long. His voice was low, careful, but as the story unfolded, the children's eyes brightened, their shoulders eased. Even the boy with the mitten let out a small laugh, quick and rough as it was. It felt strange, telling a story here, where silence had ruled so long. When he finished, the boy asked, "Will you tell another?" "Perhaps next time," Elias said, closing the book. "The road will close soon. The snow is coming." The boy's smile faded. Then hurry. The monk returned to the doorway, silent but watching. As Elias rose, he felt the weight of the children's eyes on him. Not pleading, not demanding, just waiting. Waiting for something more than bread. Outside, the cold bit sharper than before. The sky had turned a deep iron gray, and the wind carried a flurry of dry snow that stung his cheeks. The woman from earlier stood by the gate, her hands folded. "You should go now," she said softly. "Night comes fast here." Elias nodded and started down the road, the empty cart creaking behind him. But the sound of the bells lingered in his ears, and with it the memory of those watching eyes. He had thought the colony was a place of silence, but now he wondered if it was only waiting to speak. That night, he dreamed again, not of bells, but of footsteps in the snow, many footsteps, all moving toward the village. He woke before dawn, his heart heavy with a thought he had not dared voice. What if the sickness did not always stay behind the gate? The first true snow fell 3 days later, soft at first, then heavier, layering the fields in a pale sheet that swallowed paths and quieted sounds. The village awoke to a world muted and still, the only movement the slow spiral of flakes drifting past windows. Elias stood at the doorway of the bakery, breath fogging in the cold, and watched the road vanish under white. Somewhere beyond that blank horizon lay the colony, unseen now, but somehow nearer in his thoughts than before. People in the village had begun to talk more openly, their voices low, but no longer only whispers. A shepherd claimed to have found strange footprints near the lower pasture, bare, small, and leading toward the frozen brook. Another said his hound had refused to go near the old oak at dusk, growling at the empty air. Children were called home earlier, doors were latched sooner, and the bells from the colony, when they rang, seemed sharper, clearer in the brittle winter air. They no longer sounded far away. They sounded as if the wind carried them straight into the village streets. Elias worked longer hours at the bakery, though few came to buy. The cold kept people close to their hearths, and the ovens gave him warmth. But his mind wandered. At times, he thought he saw the boy from the colony in the corner of his vision, a quick shadow by the window, a figure watching from the bend in the road. Once, when he stepped outside to bring him more wood, he found a mitten lying in the snow. It was gray, damp, and familiar. He did not tell his father. Instead, he tucked it under his mattress and tried to sleep. But each night, the dreams returned, the chapel, the silent children, the monk's lantern, and always the sound of many feet in the snow, coming closer. By the week's end, the elders sent for him. Their hall was warmer than usual, a fire crackling in the hearth, but the air felt tense. One of them unrolled a parchment, its edges curled from the damp. "The colony has sent word," the elder said. "They asked for more supplies. Grain, oil, and books." "Books?" Elias asked before he could stop himself. "Yes," the elder said, his brow furrowing. "They claim the children need lessons. Stories, too. They say the nights are long." Elias's stomach turned. He thought of the boy's voice, the way he had clutched the old book. "And who will carry these things?" Another elder looked at him. "You have gone before. You know the path. And they trust you now." He wanted to refuse. He wanted to say the road was too dangerous, that the snow was too deep, that his father needed him in the bakery. But he saw in their faces that his answer had already been decided for him. To refuse was to leave the burden to another, perhaps someone less prepared, perhaps someone who would not come back. That night, the wind howled around the eaves, and the sky promised more snow. Elias packed quietly, loaves wrapped in cloth, a jar of oil, a small sack of dried beans, and the book the boy had asked for. He hesitated at the threshold, then added a second, one his grandfather had kept, a book of songs and fables, the kind that warmed a long winter night. The next morning he set out once more, the village behind him half buried in snow, the fields a sea of white. His cart wheels creaked and stuck in the drifts, and his breath rose in pale plumes. The air smelled of pine and ice. He reached the cross by midday, its arms now crusted with frozen snow. Beyond it, the mist had grown thicker, curling in strange patterns like smoke from an unseen fire. This time, he did not wait for the bells. He stepped forward, the gray world swallowing him. The colony seemed quieter than before. The huts crouched low under their snow caps, their doors closed tight. No children played by the path. The chapel bell hung silent, a rim of ice around its edge. For a moment, Elias wondered if the place had emptied in the night, leaving only ghosts to linger. Then, a faint figure appeared, small, wrapped in a cloak, mittened hands clasped before them. "The boy." "You came," the boy said, his voice barely carrying in the cold. "I thought you wouldn't." "I said I would," Elias replied. "I brought what you asked." The boy's eyes flicked to the cart, then back to his face. "Did you bring the songs?" Elias nodded and held out the book. The boy's fingers trembled as he took it, pressing it to his chest. "Come to the chapel. They wait for you." The words chilled him more than the wind. They wait for you. Who were they? The monk? The children? Or others he had yet to meet? As he followed the boy, the mist thickened until it clung to his cloak, damp and cold. He could hear faint sounds now, low voices, the scrape of something being moved, the soft creak of a door swinging on old hinges. Somewhere deeper in the colony, a bell tolled once, slow and hollow. They reached the chapel, and the monk was there, as before, lantern in hand. His face was thinner now, his eyes dark and watchful. "Elias," he said, with a faint trace of a smile, "the winter has made you bold." "Or foolish," Elias said quietly. The monk's smile did not fade. "Perhaps both." Inside, the air was thick with smoke again, but this time a different scent, pine resin and something bitter he could not name. The candles burned lower, their wax running like pale fingers down the holders. A few figures stirred in the shadows, but none spoke. Their eyes followed him, glinting in the dim. The monk gestured toward the altar, where space had been cleared. "Leave the food there," he said, "and the books." Elias obeyed, though his hands felt clumsy. The boy set the songbook beside the loaf and looked at him with something close to relief. "Will you read one?" the boy asked. Elias glanced at the monk, who nodded slowly. "If you wish." He opened the book, its pages stiff from the cold, and began a simple song. One about winter turning to spring, about fields waking after the frost. His voice was low at first, but the sound filled the chapel like a fragile thread, binding the silence for a few moments. When he finished, the boy whispered again. The monk raised his hand. "Not tonight. The road grows dark." Elias closed the book and stepped back, but his eyes lingered on the faces in the shadows. Faces pale and thin, some hidden behind cloth, some marked by the sickness, some only tired. They were watching him not as one watches a visitor, but as one waits for something more. Outside, the mist clung thicker than before, the snow falling harder now. Elias pulled his cloak tight and turned to leave. Behind him, the bell rang once, deep and hollow, and the sound followed him all the way down the road. Halfway back, he stopped. In the snow beside the path were footprints, many, and not all going in the same direction. Some led toward the colony, others toward the village. The footprints were shallow at first, blurred by the falling snow, but as Elias crouched to trace them with his gloved hand, he saw they were fresh, too fresh to have been there long. Some were small, others longer, each pressed with the soft tread of someone walking without haste. They wove across the road, vanished into drifts, reappeared near the hedgerow, then pointed unmistakably toward the distant smoke of his village. He stood there a moment, the wind pulling at his cloak. The colony was behind him, the village ahead, and these marks lay like a bridge between the two. He thought of the boy's voice asking for songs, of the monk's hollow eyes, of the way the bell had sounded, one slow, heavy note, as if marking not a beginning or an end, but a step. By the time he reached the first houses, the snow was falling harder, muffling the crunch of his boots. A few shutters cracked open, narrow eyes peering out, then vanishing before he could meet them. Smoke curled from the baker's chimney, and the glow of the oven spilled into the cold air. His father was at the door before he reached it. "You stayed too long," the old man said, pulling him in. "The snow will trap us soon." Elias set down the empty cart. "The road is still passable," he said, "but I saw tracks. Many, coming from the hills." His father stiffened, his hands still dusted with flour. "Did you follow them?" "No," Elias replied. "I follow the road." "Good." His father's gaze drifted to the door, then lowered. "It is better not to follow such things." That evening, the village hall filled again. Men and women gathered close to the fire, their breath rising in the cold. The elders spoke in low tones, but this time there was no effort to hush the room. Fear had already slipped between them like the wind through the cracks. "They're coming closer," one man said. "My son found a mitten in the orchard. It was not his." "They want more than bread," said another. "Why else would they ask for books?" A woman clutched her shawl tighter. "I heard them in the night," she whispered. "Bells. Not from a hill, from the brook." As if the fog itself carried them. Elias listened, silent. The firelight flickered across the elders' faces, shadows stretching long. One of them finally spoke. "We will keep the road open for now," he said, "but no one goes alone. And if the snow thickens, the path will close." The murmurs died to a heavy stillness. The meeting ended without decision, only the weight of winter pressing closer. Days passed, the snow deepened, and the world shrank to the space between hearth and door. Elias baked bread, hauled wood, mended the shutters. Yet each evening, when the wind quieted, he thought he heard the bells, sometimes far, sometimes near, never the same number of notes. Once, waking before dawn, he swore he saw a figure by the old oak at the edge of the field, small, still, watching. On the seventh night, a knock came at their door. It was not the sharp rap of a villager, but a slow, deliberate sound. Elias's father opened it halfway, and a gust of cold followed the figure on the step. It was a man from the tannery, cloak heavy with snow, his eyes hollow with worry. "They found something," he said, "near the brook." The elders called for a lantern search. Men with shovels and dogs trudged into the dark, their lights bobbing like faint stars across the white fields. Elias followed, though his father told him not to. Curiosity had grown sharper than fear. At the brook, where the water ran black between crusted banks, the snow was trampled. A shape lay against the reeds, small, wrapped in gray. For a moment, Elias thought it was the boy, but as they turned the body over, the truth chilled him more than the wind. It was a villager, a girl from the weaver's house, no more than 14. Her face was pale, her fingers bare, her cloak lined with frost. There were no marks of sickness on her skin, only a single mitten in her hand, not hers, but the same dull gray as the one he had found. "She was seen 2 nights ago," the tanner said, "fetching water." The elders said little, only ordered her carried back, and the path to the brook closed. But Elias saw the looks they exchanged, the way their eyes slid from the girl's frozen face to the hill beyond the fields. The next morning, the bells rang again. Twice. Slow, deliberate. Elias stood at the bakery door and felt a pull, not of duty, but of something deeper. The colony had not come to the village, not openly. Yet their shadow had. The footprints, the mitten, the girl, they were pieces of a thread he could not yet see the end of. That night, he opened the old book again, the one of songs and fables. His fingers traced the lines, but his thoughts were far from the words. He remembered the boy's whisper, "Hurry." He remembered the monk's voice. Sickness does not only touch the skin. The snow pressed against the window. Somewhere beyond the white, the colony waited. And now, the bells did not feel like warnings. They felt like invitations. The bells rang again 2 nights later, this time at dusk, just as the village lamps were being lit and the snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes. Their sound was slow and heavy, echoing across the frozen fields, and every door along the main street seemed to pause mid-hinge. Elias was at the bakery, pulling a loaf from the oven, when he heard them. He stood there for a long moment, heat on his face, cold at his back, the sound carrying through the stillness like a summons. No one in the village spoke it aloud, but everyone heard it. By morning, the road to the colony had vanished beneath a fresh layer of snow. Tracks from the night before were softened, their edges blurred. But a new set appeared, small prints, too light for a grown man, leading from the lower path toward the fields. The shepherd claimed they had not been there when he went to check the flock at dusk. Now they wound across the frozen earth, and halfway along the brook, They simply stopped, as though the snow had swallowed them whole. The elders gathered again, their faces drawn tight in the cold. One muttered about closing the road entirely. Another argued that would only anger the colony, that offerings must still be sent lest hunger or cold push them to desperation. The village was divided now. Some wanted to cut ties completely, others to strengthen them, believing it's safer to feed the silent settlement than risk what lay beyond its gates. Elias listened, his hands clasped in his lap, his mind turning over the same memory. The boy asking for songs, the mitten in the snow, the frozen girl by the brook. The colony was not just a place of sickness now. It was a presence, one that reached beyond its boundary without ever showing its face. Subtler things began to change. The baker's dog, once eager to patrol the yard, now refused to leave the hearth. Chickens laid fewer eggs. The river near the mill froze early, though the winter was not yet at its deepest. Some nights, villagers swore they saw faint lights in the fields, moving slow as if carried by hand. Others claimed to hear quiet knocks at their doors, only to open them and find nothing but the drifting snow. Through it all, Elias found himself torn between two worlds. The colony called to him with its strange stillness and the memory of children waiting for stories. The village pulled at him with its fear, its familiar hearth, its unspoken plea to stay where he belonged. Each time he closed his eyes, the bells threaded through his thoughts. His father noticed his restlessness. One evening, while kneading dough by the fire, he spoke without looking up. "You've been elsewhere," he said. "Your hands are here, but your head is in the snow." Elias did not answer at first. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind scraped against the shutters. "They are not what we think," he said at last. His father's hand stilled. "They are what they must be," the old man replied. "And we are what we must be. Keep the bread warm. Keep the door closed." But the next day, a different kind of news arrived. The weaver's family, still mourning their lost daughter, reported a voice at their window during the night, a soft whisper asking for her name. They swore they saw a shape in the snow, no taller than a child, but when they opened the door, the yard was empty. The elders decided to send a meeting party, a small group, armed and cautious, to speak with the colony's monk. They asked Elias to go with them, not to carry food this time, but to listen, to see what words might be exchanged. He agreed, though unease coiled in his chest. They set out at dawn. Elias, the tanner, a young man from the mill, and two elders wrapped in heavy cloaks. The snow was deeper now, their boots sinking to the ankle, their breath rising in clouds. The road felt narrower, the cross at its turn half buried. When they reached the mist, the bells rang once, slow and low, and the tanner muttered a prayer under his breath. The gate was closed this time. A rope of frost clung to its hinges. They called out, their voices swallowed by the fog, and at last the monk appeared, lantern in hand, his face more hollow than Elias remembered. "We do not take visitors now," he said. "You took our bread," one elder replied. "You asked for books, and you gave them," the monk said. The knock lingered in Elias's thoughts long after the snow had covered its traces. He lay awake that night, listening to the wind push against the walls, his father breathing steadily in the next room. Every creak in the old wood seemed louder now, every gust of cold air like a whisper. By dawn, he had not slept, and the uneaten bread still sat on the table where they had left it. The village began to murmur. Some said the prints were a warning. Others thought they were an invitation. A few believed it was neither, that the colony no longer asked for offerings or prayers, but for something far more costly. Doors that once opened to neighbors now stayed shut longer. Lamps were lit earlier. The sound of children playing faded from the streets, replaced by hurried steps and glances over the shoulder. Elias noticed how the young mill worker, one of the few who had gone with him to the gates, avoided his gaze now. The tanner, once a man of loud opinions, spoke only in mutters, and the elders, those who were meant to lead, had begun to meet in smaller, quieter gatherings, their words carried on the smoke that rose from shuttered rooms. The prince returned 3 nights later. This time, they were larger, heavier, as though the snow bore a deeper weight. They circled the well in the center of the village and stopped at the baker's door again. Elias found them at dawn, sharp and clear, the kind that did not fade, even when the wind blew across them. He followed them as far as the edge of the fields before they disappeared, swallowed by the mist that hung low along the ground. His father said nothing, only locked the door that night and set a heavy bar against it. "If the elders will not act," the old man murmured, "then the snow will decide for them." But Elias could not leave it there. Each passing day tightened the air in the village, and each night the bells stayed silent, which somehow felt worse than when they rang. He thought of the boy again, of his bright eyes and his hunger for stories. He thought of the mitten, the songbook, the girl by the brook. He wondered if she had once walked to the bakery too. One afternoon, while the sky was still pale, he took the long path behind the mill. The snow was heavy, but the air was clearer than it had been in days. There, at the edge of the frozen stream, he saw something that made his breath catch, a ribbon caught in the branches of a low tree, stiff with frost. It was not from the colony. It was the weaver's daughter's, the same ribbon she had worn before she vanished. He picked it up, turning it over in his gloved hands, and that was when he heard the faintest chime. Not the great bells. This was softer, closer, like the ring of small charm. It came from the trees across the stream, where the mist began to gather again. For a moment, he thought he saw a shape there, small, no taller than a child, standing still among the white trunks. "Who are you?" he whispered, though he knew the snow would carry his words nowhere. The shape did not move. Then the chime sounded once more, and when he blinked, it was gone. He brought the ribbon back to the village, but when he showed it to the elders, their faces only tightened further. "Do not bring such things here," one of them said. "There are threads we do not pull." Elias set the ribbon on the table that night and stared at it while the fire burned low. He felt the weight of it, of what it meant that the colony's shadow was not a distant thing, but a creeping one. And he wondered if the knocks at their door were not warnings, but requests, small voices asking to be heard in a place that no longer wanted to listen. The next day, the monk appeared in the village square. No bells had rung. No one had called for him. He simply stood there, cloak heavy with frost, eyes sunken as though he had not seen sleep in many nights. "Something moves between us," he said, his voice barely above a breath. "It is neither ours nor yours now." The crowd gathered fast, their fear sharper than the cold. Some demanded answers, some wanted him gone. But Elias stepped forward. "Then tell us what it is," he said. The monk's gaze met his. "Not all who walk in the snow are living, and not all who wait behind our walls chose to stay." A murmur rippled through the square. Before anyone could press him further, he turned and began to walk back toward the road. No one followed. That night, the prince came again, this time leading not to the bakery, but to the weaver's empty house. The cold pressed harder as the days stretched on, each one slower than the last. The villagers no longer lingered in the square. Windows stayed dark longer. Even the dogs seemed to sense something waiting at the edges of the fields. Elias could feel it in the air, thick, heavy, like a weight hanging just beyond sight. Every time the wind shifted, it carried with it a faint, metallic smell, almost like old iron. The prince came and went, leaving marks near the well, near the baker's door, near the empty weaver's house. They never led anywhere new, only circled like a question no one dared to answer. One evening, the elders called a gathering in the hall, though they spoke as if it were only to calm fears. The hall was dim, smoke curling around the rafters, the fire too weak to warm the crowded room. They spoke of keeping doors shut, of prayer, of patience. But they did not speak of the ribbon, or the chimes, or the marks that had begun to appear on the trees by the stream. Strange, pale scratches that almost looked like letters. Elias sat in the back, his hands tight around the ribbon he still kept in his coat. He wanted to stand, to demand what they were hiding, but every pair of eyes he met seemed to carry the same message: silence. Even his father, who had once argued with the elders without fear, now stared at the ground. When the meeting ended, Elias stepped out into the snow alone. The sky was deep gray, the kind that meant another storm was coming. The road that led toward the colony stretched out like a scar across the field, the stones barely visible beneath the frost. He thought of the girl's laugh, of the boy who had once dared him to run beyond the gates, of the monk's warning. Something moved between them. The monk had said, "Not theirs, not ours, something else." That night, the knocking came again. Louder, harder, not at one door, but many. The whole village seemed to wake at once, dogs barking, shutters rattling. Elias threw on his coat and stepped outside, the cold biting his face. There in the square stood three shapes. Not cloaked, not hooded, only shadows in the swirling snow. They did not move. They did not speak. And yet every heart in the village seemed to stop as one. A door opened somewhere, then slammed shut again. Someone whispered a prayer. The shapes turned, slow and silent, and began to walk, not toward the colony, but past it, down the narrow road that led to the stream. And as they passed, the snow around them seemed to deepen, as if the earth itself was bowing under their weight. Elias followed, not close enough to be seen, but close enough to hear the crunch of their steps. He followed them past the mill, past the frozen brook, to the place where the ribbon had hung. There they stopped. One of the shadows knelt, touching the ice. The faint chimes sounded again, this time joined by a second and a third, like a small, broken melody. His breath clouded in the dark. His heart beat so loud it felt as though it might give him away. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, the shadows were gone. Only the wind moved now, scattering flakes across the empty path. When he returned to the village, the elders were waiting. They said nothing at first, only stared at him as if he had brought the cold in with him. Finally, one spoke. "You will stay away from that road." Elias looked from one face to the next. "Why?" he asked. "Because some doors," the oldest elder said, "are not meant to be opened twice." The days that followed were worse. Livestock began to vanish from the edge of the pastures. A smell like damp stone lingered near the well. Children woke screaming in the night, saying they had heard bells just outside their windows. The monk did not return. The gates of the colony stayed closed, but the mist beyond them grew thicker, reaching further each day, until even the road to the next village seemed swallowed by it. Elias could not stay still anymore. Something was pulling at the edges of his thoughts, a thread he could not stop touching. He began to watch the gates at dawn, at dusk, waiting for the shapes to appear again. And one evening they did. This time there were four. He did not wait for them to leave the road. He followed, his feet sinking into the deepening snow, his breath sharp in the freezing air. They moved faster now, as if they knew he was there, leading him toward the field where the stones broke through the frost like bones. The wind was louder here, howling through the bare branches. And then he saw it, not the shadows, but the lights. Small, pale, flickering just beyond the mist. Not torches, not lamps. Something colder, something that did not belong to the living. The air tightened in his chest. He took another step, then another, until the village was only a smear of dark behind him. The snow here bore no prints, and yet he knew the shadows had passed. He felt it, like the echo of a bell that had not rung. Something waited in that mist, something that had been reaching for them all along. The cold grew sharper as Elias stood in the open field, staring into the mist that wrapped the horizon like a wall. Each breath stung his lungs. Each step sank deeper into the snow. The lights ahead flickered faintly, never steady, as though the air itself was swallowing them. Behind him, the village was a fading shadow. The bells had not rung. No one had called for him. Yet he felt as if he had been expected. The wind carried whispers, faint, stretched, almost human. He stopped, straining to hear, but they faded as soon as they rose. There was no path now, only a faint hollow in the snow where others had walked before. His boots followed it instinctively. His fingers brushing the ribbon he kept hidden in his coat pocket. Somewhere beyond that curtain of white, the truth waited. Whether it was meant to be found or feared, he did not know. The trees thinned as he pressed on. A broken fence jutted from the frost, its posts leaning like tired sentries. Beyond it lay a row of dark stones, half buried. He bent down, brushing the snow from one, then another. Names, carved in crooked letters, long faded. Some he recognized, people who had vanished from the village seasons ago. Their graves faced the colony. The lights shifted then, closer now, but still soft, still cold. Elias felt his chest tighten. The wind died suddenly, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat. A shape moved between the lights, tall, wrapped in a heavy cloak, its outline blurred by the mist. Behind it, smaller forms followed, heads bowed, steps slow and deliberate. He crouched low, his fingers digging into the snow for balance. They were not walking aimlessly. They were carrying something long, narrow, wrapped in dark cloth. It took him a moment to realize it was a stretcher. The chimes sounded again, not one this time, but many, scattered and uneven, like fragments of a melody broken by distance. The figures stopped at the line of stones. One knelt, placing a hand upon the earth, and the others lowered the stretcher beside it. Elias could see their breath in the cold air, but their movements were silent, rehearsed, as if this ritual had been repeated many times before. His legs felt heavy, but he inched closer, the snow crunching softly beneath him. He wanted to call out, to ask who they were, what they carried, why the graves were marked with familiar names. But something in the air held him still. The mist thickened suddenly, curling around his legs like smoke. The lights brightened once, then dimmed. When his eyes adjusted, the figures were gone. The stretcher was gone. Only the stones remained, and a faint line of prints leading deeper toward the colony gates. He turned back, but the village was no longer visible. The wind had erased his trail. For a moment, panic rose sharp in his chest. He spun, searching for any sign of movement, but the field stretched silent in all directions. Then he saw it. The door. Not a gate, not a wall, just a door standing alone in the snow. Its wood was dark, heavy, the hinges rusted. It was too far from the colony to belong to its walls, yet it faced the same direction. A thin rope hung from its handle, and at the end of the rope, a small bell. Elias approached slowly, the ribbon in his pocket twisting between his fingers. The door did not move. There were no tracks around it, no marks in the snow, and yet it looked worn, as if many hands had touched it. He reached out, his breath clouding the air, and his fingers brushed the bell. It rang once, soft, clear, a sound that seemed too loud for the empty field. Far away, he heard an answer, a distant, mournful toll from the colony bells. And then the mist began to move. It curled higher, swirling around the stones, around the lonely door. Shadows flickered within it, too fast to follow. The air grew colder still, biting at his skin through the fabric. His hand lingered on the rope, but he did not pull. Somewhere in the distance, a voice whispered his name. He stumbled back, heart racing. The field was no longer empty. Shapes stirred within the mist. Some crawling, some standing, some moving like they remembered the act, but not the purpose. The bell rang again, though he had not touched it. This time the sound echoed far longer, fading into a hush that pressed against his ears. He turned, looking for a way back, but the trail was gone. The only thing left was the door, the graves, and the path that led deeper still toward the colony he had been warned never to approach. He took a step toward it, then another. The air grew heavier. His breath came slower, and from somewhere just ahead, the faintest flicker of warm light broke through the mist, faint, fragile, as if waiting for him to choose whether to follow it or turn back before it was too late. The air felt almost solid as Elias stepped closer to the door. Every breath clung to his throat like frost. The warm light ahead pulsed faintly, as if it were alive, and each flicker drew him in a little more. Behind him, the field stretched into darkness, the village now only a memory swallowed by the mist. The ribbon in his pocket felt heavier, as though it carried the weight of every unanswered question. He stopped a few paces away, his boots sinking into the snow with a muffled crunch. The door loomed taller now, the rope swaying gently though no wind moved. The bell trembled with emotion, ringing just enough to tease the air. He wondered how many had stood where he did, staring at this same door, caught between the fear of knowing and the ache of not. Something shifted in the mist, quick, like a breath taken behind him. He turned sharply, but but the field was empty. Only the stones, the pale markers with fading names, seemed to lean closer now, their tops glinting faintly with frost. A whisper carried through the cold. Not a word, just a sigh that felt familiar. He reached for the handle. The metal was colder than the air, biting his glove as he wrapped his fingers around it. For a heartbeat, he thought he felt something pulse through it, a faint rhythm like a distant drumbeat. The warm light brightened, spilling a pale glow around the edges of the doorframe, though no source could be seen beyond it. He pulled. The door creaked open, slow and reluctant. No hinges groaned, yet the sound seemed to echo far, as if he had opened something more than wood. The mist recoiled slightly, revealing a narrow path lined with broken lanterns, their glass cracked and empty. The ground beneath was not snow but a thin layer of ash, gray and soft, though his boots left no clear tracks. The warm light came from further in now, weaving between the fog like a thread. He stepped through. The air changed instantly, colder but still. The wind that had chased him across the field no longer reached here. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made each sound of his own body feel loud. The beat of his heart, the scrape of his boots, the tight draw of his breath. The path curved toward a low wall, half buried, with a gate standing ajar. Beyond it, shadows moved, not with purpose, more like fragments drifting in water. Elias crouched low, watching them. They did not seem to notice him, or perhaps they had no reason to. They moved in a slow rhythm, gathering around something in the center he could not yet see. The bell behind him rang again, distant now, as though calling from the world he had left. Elias pressed forward, his hands brushing the cold stones. Each one bore marks, symbols, scratches, some deep as though carved by nails, others faint like worn writing. He traced one with his glove, but the stone was brittle, flaking at his touch. At the center of the wall's enclosure, a figure stood. It was tall, wrapped in a cloak the color of old parchment, its hood drawn low. Around its feet, the drifting shapes clustered, silent, unmoving, like children waiting for a story. In its hands, the figure held a long staff tipped with a piece of tarnished metal that caught the dim light. It raised its head. For a moment, Elias thought he saw a face, or something like one, marked by deep lines, the kind that came not from age but from something heavier. Its gaze passed over him, not quite seeing, not quite blind. Then it spoke. "You should not be here." The voice was neither kind nor cruel. It was tired. Tired in the way the stones were tired, in the way the bells had sounded that first night. Worn by repetition, hollowed by time. Elias stepped closer, his breath visible in the stillness. "You've been coming to the village," he said. "Taking things, leaving marks." The figure tilted its head. "We take nothing. We remember what is owed." "What is owed?" His voice cracked, louder than he intended. The drifting shapes stirred faintly at the sound. The figure pointed with its staff, past the wall, past the mist. There, faint but growing clearer, were rows of doors. Not one, dozens, each standing alone, each with its own bell, each facing the same invisible line. "They built this between us," the figure said, "and left it to us to keep." The warm light flickered again, now behind those doors. Elias felt it on his skin. Not heat, not cold, something older. A tremor passed through the ground, faint but steady, like the breath of something sleeping. He turned back, toward the way he had come, but the door was gone. Only the mist remained, and now the bells were ringing, faint, scattered, distant, but growing in number. The bells grew louder, their echoes threading through the mist like a warning that came too late. Elias turned in every direction, but the sound had no source. One moment far away, the next right beside his ear. The figure with the staff did not move, nor did the drifting shapes at its feet. They only watched, silent, as if waiting for something else to arrive. The ground beneath him seemed to shift again, not a tremor this time, but a slow sinking, as though the earth itself was breathing in. A faint glow lit the path behind the cloaked figure, and for the first time, Elias saw that the rows of doors were not fixed. They were moving, sliding across the snow without tracks, rearranging themselves into a crooked line that pointed toward him. Each bell swung gently, ringing with a sound that no longer seemed tied to metal. It was a thin, aching note, like a memory trying to stay alive. He took a step back. The air was heavier now, pressing against his chest. He reached for the ribbon in his pocket, and it was warm, far warmer than it should have been in that cold. When he opened his hand, it glowed faintly, the red thread catching the light from the moving doors. The glow grew brighter as the bells tolled, and suddenly the drifting shapes stirred, turning toward him. One stepped forward. It was smaller than the others, no taller than a child, and as it came closer, he saw its face, or what was left of it. Not bones, not a mask, but the pale outline of features worn smooth by time. And yet, something in its gaze struck him cold. The same eyes he had seen once by the stream, the same height, the same tilt of the head. It reached out, a hand forming from a mist. In its fingers, it held a scrap of fabric. Another ribbon, the same color as the one in his hand. Elias froze. The two pieces matched perfectly. The cloaked figure finally spoke again, its voice carrying over the bells. "They never left you," it said. "You left them." The words twisted in his chest. "What are you saying?" "They were sent away," the figure said, raising its staff, "not to heal, but to wait. To bear the burden your village cast off." The bells rang harder now, faster, until the air trembled. The doors began to open one by one, each spilling a faint thread of light into the snow. Behind them, shapes shifted, some familiar, some too faint to name, all watching. Elias stepped forward, his boots crunching on the ashen path. "What do you want from us?" he asked. The figure turned its hood toward the farthest door, the largest one, its bell ringing slow and deep. "Not want," it said. "Owed." The ground gave a sudden lurch, and from the mist rose something long hidden, a wall of stones, broken and uneven, stretching far to either side. Carved into them were names, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, some so worn they were only grooves. Among them, Elias saw his own family name, etched more than once. His breath caught. The villagers had always spoken of the colony as a place apart, a place that demanded offerings and fear. But this wall told a different story. This was a ledger, and it was not yet complete. The bells reached a peak then, their tones overlapping, clashing. The childlike shape dropped the ribbon into his hand and retreated into the mist. The other figures began to move too, circling the enclosure slowly, their pale outlines slipping between the doors. The cloaked one lifted its staff high, and the mist behind it parted, revealing the faint outline of the colony gates at last. They were open, and there, just inside, stood more figures, rows of them, waiting. The light pulsed again, brighter now, spilling over the threshold and casting long shadows across the snow. The ribbons in his hand burned like embers. Behind him, the way home was gone. Before him, the weight of generations pressed in. And somewhere, beneath the clamor of the bells, he thought he heard it, a single voice calling his name. Not angry, not pleading, just waiting. The nights grew longer as autumn settled in, and the village near the old leper colony began to feel the weight of something unseen pressing upon it. Rumors traveled like cold wind, unpredictable and cutting. Some said they had seen strange figures walking near the crumbling gates of the colony, their steps slow, their forms barely visible in the mist. Others whispered that the old bell in the chapel, long rusted and silent, had rung faintly one evening when no one was near enough to pull its rope. Whether truth or fear-fed illusion, these stories were enough to keep doors locked and fires burning late into the night. Thomas kept his journal close, now filling its pages with details not only about the history of the colony, but about the uneasy stillness that clung to the village. He noted the way the villagers paused mid-step when someone mentioned the colony, how their faces tightened, how their eyes flickered toward the dark road that led there. It was more than fear. It was as though they carried the memory of something they could never quite speak aloud. Ellen, who had once promised to help him uncover the hidden records, had grown strangely distant. She now avoided his questions and offered only vague reassurances, saying the past was best left undisturbed. But Thomas felt he was too far in to turn back. He had come across a bundle of old letters found beneath loose boards in the back of the village storehouse. They were fragile, their edges eaten by time, but still legible. They told of a winter long ago when the colony had been sealed off more harshly than usual, not because of plague, but because something else had happened within its walls. One letter spoke of a night patrol that went missing entirely, leaving only scattered torches near the frozen creek. Another told of a villager who had gone to deliver food and never returned, though his cart was later found, empty and overturned. The letters were unsigned, but Thomas felt the urgency in the words. They carried the tremor of real fear, the kind that only comes from seeing something you cannot explain. He began to suspect that the leper colony had not been only a place of sickness and isolation, but also of secrets, some kept for mercy, others perhaps to protect those outside from something within. As the nights grew colder, the colony felt less like a ruin and more like a place holding its breath, waiting. The second twist came not with a sudden noise or a shadow at the door, but with a name. Ellen, after days of avoiding him, finally came to see him one evening. She brought with her a single page from the monastery archives, an inventory list of the colony's inhabitants from over 300 years ago. At the bottom was a name that sent a ripple through Thomas's thoughts, Elias Brandt. It was the same name carved faintly into the lintel of the chapel door, the same name he had seen half buried beneath lichen on a stone by the overgrown path. But what startled him was the notation beside it, transferred, not due to illness. Transferred? To where? And why if not for illness? Thomas pressed her for answers, but Ellen only shook her head, her hands twisting the edge of her shawl. That name, she whispered, is still not spoken here. Not because of plague, because of what followed him. From that moment, everything sharpened. Thomas began to look for Elias Brandt in every ledger, every faded record, and in doing so, he found traces that should not have existed. Elias had been recorded in 2 places at once, still living in the colony, and yet also listed among those who had supposedly left during a rare transfer. The dates did not align. Some entries were struck through with heavy ink, others left deliberately blank. It was as if someone, long ago, had tried to rewrite the story but had not been able to fully erase the truth. Meanwhile, the villagers grew restless. Livestock began disappearing, not in large numbers, but enough to notice. A goat taken from its pen, a few hens gone without trace, a dog that had barked for 3 nights and then was never heard again. The old woman who had first warned Thomas to stay away now refused to step outside after dusk. Children whispered about a figure near the frozen creek, a man wrapped in tattered robes who moved without sound. Thomas did not know if these were stories born from fear or if something long kept silent was truly stirring. He decided to visit the colony once more, this time with lanterns and stronger resolve. He took with him a local carpenter, Jonas, who had less fear of the place than most. They entered through the northern archway, the stones slick with moss, the iron gates hanging half off their hinges. The air was still, heavy with the scent of old earth and rain. They passed rows of collapsed dwellings, their beams splintered, their roofs open to the stars. It was in the old infirmary that Thomas felt it, the shift in the air, the hush like a held breath. They found a locked chest there, hidden behind a fallen beam. Inside were torn scraps of cloth, several crude carvings of saints with their faces scratched away, and a folded parchment sealed with wax that had long since cracked. The letter was brief but chilling. He is not like the others. The sickness does not claim him, and yet it follows him. Watch the nights. Do not open the chapel doors after dark. Thomas stared at the words, as if they might rearrange themselves into something less alarming, but they did not. Elias Brandt had been something else. Perhaps not sick, but still confined, still feared. Was it possible that this man had been more than a patient? That he had been part of something the villagers had been trying to bury for generations? The discovery spread quietly, but it did not stay hidden. Within a few days, The village was split. Those who said Thomas was stirring old ghosts, and those who believed the truth had to come out, no matter how long it had been locked away. Strange nights returned. The chapel bell, silent for decades, rang faintly again one foggy dawn, though no one stood in the belfry. Footprints were found in the frost near the colony gates, bare, elongated, as though the toes dragged slightly. Thomas wrote everything down, even his doubt gnawed at him. Was this history, or was it something that had been left behind in more than memory? Jonas, the carpenter, now refused to help him further. Ellen kept her distance once more. The blacksmith boarded his windows after his youngest woke screaming about a man standing in the field, staring, not moving. The cold had settled in for good now, creeping beneath doors and finding its way into the bones of the village. The frost lay heavier on the fields each morning, and the path to the leper colony grew wider with every passing night. Thomas found himself walking that path more often, despite the warnings, despite the looks from the villagers that were beginning to turn from worry to something sharper, resentment, perhaps, or the old, instinctive fear of anyone who stirred what should remain still. The night before the winter fair, he made his way there again, lantern in hand, his steps muffled by the frozen ground. The air was so still it seemed to carry the sound of his breath farther than it should have. Jonas had refused to join him this time, and Ellen had stopped speaking to him altogether, yet Thomas could not stop. The letters, the footprints, the strange shifting of the air, it all pointed to something that was not finished. He could not write his account of the colony honestly without knowing what that something was. Inside the crumbling gate, the world was silent except for the groan of the trees. The infirmary stood as he had left it, but the chapel door, long locked and stiff, now hung ajar. The iron keyhole glinted in the light of his lantern, empty. The snow at the threshold was disturbed, marked by those same bare, dragging prints he had seen days before. He hesitated, his breath turning to mist before stepping inside. The air within was colder than the night outside. The stone walls seemed to breathe, their surface damp and uneven. The pews were gone, broken and rotted away, leaving only dark marks where they had once stood. At the far end, the altar leaned crookedly, its cloth eaten through, and above it hung the faint outline of a cross, carved so deeply into the wall it looked as though someone had tried to scrape it out with desperate hands. And there, in the dim light, something moved. Not a figure, not fully formed, but a shift in the shadows that made him step back and lift the lantern higher. The air thickened. He thought of the letter. Do not open the chapel doors after dark. His fingers tightened around the handle of the lantern, its flame shivering in the sudden draft. He called out, quietly, uncertainly, but the sound seemed to fall flat, as though the walls absorbed it. The shadow did not move again. Only the smell lingered, something dry, almost sweet, like earth turned too long without sun. Thomas set the lantern down and bent to examine the floor. There were marks there, old and new, as though something had been dragged across the stone toward the altar. And beneath the altar, he saw the edge of a wooden trapdoor, so blackened with age it was nearly part of the floor itself. The discovery sent a cold thrill through him. A hidden place sealed beneath the chapel. What could have been kept there? He tried to lift it, but the hinges would not give. It had been shut a long time. As he strained against it, he thought he heard something faint from below. Not a voice, not a word. More like a breath drawn in, long and slow. He stumbled back, heart hammering, and in that moment the lantern flickered low. The flame stretched thin, then brightened again, but when it did, the chapel no longer felt empty. He could not have said why. No shape stood there. No face peered from the dark. Yet every nerve in his body told him he was no longer alone. The next morning, he told no one what he had found. The village was already tense, and to speak of hidden doors and moving shadows would only deepen the unease. But that night, the bell rang again, 3 low, uneven tolls that echoed across the fields. This time, others heard it too. Doors opened, faces peered out, and murmurs began to rise like smoke. Children were gathered close to their mothers. Men stood in the frost, staring toward the path, their hands gripping lantern poles too tightly. The sound faded, leaving only the whisper of the wind, and then the village was still again. But in the morning, they found the butcher's dog lying at the edge of the field, cold and stiff, with those same dragging prints leading from its body to the road toward the colony. The name Elias Brandt began to be spoken again, now not in whispers but in sharp tones, as if naming the past might somehow bind it. Some said Thomas had woken him by prying where he should not. Others said the colony had been stirring long before he came, and he was only the unlucky one to notice. Ellen appeared at his door one dawn, her face pale, her shawl drawn tight. She would not come in, but she pressed something into his hand, a rusted key, long and crooked. "This is for my grandfather's things," she said, her voice barely carrying. He said it belonged to the old chapel. "If you go again, go when the sun is highest, and do not go alone." Then she left, and Thomas stood with the key in his palm, feeling its weight and the weight of what it meant. The villagers might bar their doors, they might whisper and blame, but the colony was not done with them. Not yet. Thomas waited until the sun was at its peak, though the light did little to warm the frost that had turned the fields brittle. The key Ellen had given him sat heavy in his coat pocket, as if carrying more than its own weight. He told no one where he was going, though he sensed that some of the villagers guessed. Faces turned away as he passed, and a few shutters closed, but he could feel their eyes on his back, following him down the road toward the colony. The gates stood as before, rust gnawing at their hinges, the arch looming like the open mouth of something that should have been buried long ago. He stepped inside, the air colder than it had any right to be under a bright sun. The chapel waited, its doors swinging slightly in the wind, as if expecting him. When he crossed the threshold, the silence pressed in so thick it felt alive. His boots clicked on the stone as he walked to the altar, to the trapdoor that had haunted his thoughts since the moment he first saw it. The key slid into the lock with a slow, grinding sound, as though it were waking something old. The hinge creaked when he pulled, and the smell that rose from the dark was sharp and dry, like dust that had lain untouched for centuries. He lowered the lantern, its light trembling down into the hole, and saw a narrow stair spiraling into blackness. For a long moment, he stood there, his breath fogging in the still air. Then he climbed down. The stairs ended in a small stone chamber. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, and on those shelves lay bundles of cloth. No, not bundles. Shapes, shrunken, twisted, their bones pressing like questions through the rotted wrappings. He had expected bodies. This had been a colony, after all, but what froze him was their faces. They were marked, not by disease, but by carvings, symbols etched deep into the bone, as though someone had tried to write something that flesh could not contain. At the far end of the chamber stood a chair, and in that chair sat what had once been a man. His robe was gray with age, his hands folded as if in prayer, and on the floor at his feet was a ring of iron, broken in two. The name came unbidden, Elias Brandt. Thomas knew it before his eyes found the carving on the wall above him. Deep, gouged letters spelling Elias. The body had not rotted like the others. It was dry, brittle, but whole, as though time had stopped reaching for him. Thomas took a step closer, and something shifted. The air changed, not with wind, but with the sense of presence, a weight settling on his shoulders. He felt the walls lean inward, the silence growing so dense it seemed to hum. And then he saw it, the eyes. They were closed at first, sunken deep into the skull. Thomas did not stop walking until the village lights were no more than faint stars in the distance. His breath turned to clouds in the cold night, and the road stretched endlessly before him. The rusted key pressed against his chest with every step, and the journal felt heavier in his satchel than it had ever felt before. Though his body moved forward, his mind was still in that cold, stone chamber beneath the chapel, still hearing the faint creak of old wood and the dry breath that should not have been. When dawn came, he found himself on a hill overlooking a frozen river. The sun rose pale, casting a thin gold over the fields, and for a brief moment the world felt ordinary again. But even in that weak light, he could not shake the feeling that he had carried something with him, something unseen, patient, and aware. The rusted key was colder than the morning air, and when he held it in his hand, the frost seemed to creep up his fingers faster than before. He stopped in a small town 2 days' journey away, hoping for distance, hoping for clarity. The innkeeper there was kind enough, but wary. People in this region had a way of reading the road on a man's face, and Thomas knew his carried more than travel. He did not speak of the colony. He wrote in his journal at night, carefully, every line a tether to what he had witnessed. He described the carved faces, the broken ring, the eyes that had opened when they should not have. And yet, when he closed the book, the room always felt smaller, as though the walls leaned just a little closer than before. News traveled slowly, but it always traveled. A merchant passing through brought word. The bell had rung again, this time 3 times at dawn, and a young boy had vanished from the village near the colony. His footprints led to the chapel path, then stopped. No blood, no struggle, only the prints and the silence. The villagers had barred the gates again, but some said the air was colder now, and the frost would not lift from their fields. Thomas considered returning, not out of courage, but because a part of him felt unfinished, pulled. But something else held him back, a memory of that gaze in the darkness. If the colony had been a prison, then what had he done by opening it? Was Elias Brandt now moving beyond its walls? Or had he always been able to move, waiting only for the right moment to be remembered again? Ellen's name appeared in his thoughts more often than he wished. He wondered if she was safe, if the villagers blamed her for giving him the key. He wrote her a letter, but did not send it. There was no address he could bear to write on the envelope. Winter thickened. The river froze over entirely, and travelers spoke of strange figures seen at night, men walking without leaving tracks, cloaked in robes too thin for the cold. One farmer swore he had seen a face at his window, pale as the moon, but when he rushed outside, the snow was untouched. Thomas listened and said nothing. Each story echoed the same quiet warning. The past does not stay buried when its name is spoken too often. The key began to change in his possession. Its rust grew darker, almost black, and the air around it seemed colder when he laid it on the table. Once, in the stillness before dawn, he thought he heard the faint toll of a bell through the walls of his rented room. Impossible, too far, yet it came clear as if the wind had carried it straight to his ear. He began to dream of the chapel. Always the same, the open door, the shadowed altar, the carved name above the trapdoor. Sometimes the figure in the chair was gone, leaving only the broken ring on the floor. Other times, the eyes were open from the start, watching him cross the threshold. In the last dream, the figure stood, tall and whole, the robes moving as though stirred by a breeze that never reached Thomas. When he woke, the key lay on his chest, though he had left it on the table before sleep. The climax of the story was not a single night of horror, but the slow tightening of a thread that had been pulled loose centuries ago. The villagers had sealed Elias Brandt away because they believed his presence fed the sickness, or perhaps because his sickness was never meant for flesh. They had carved his name, locked the doors, and rung the bell only when the air grew too heavy to bear. Thomas had not freed him, not entirely, but he had unbound something that remembered his name. By the time spring whispered at the edges of the frost, Thomas had decided he would not return to the village. He would carry the truth, write it plainly, and leave the rest to those who would come after. But one night before the thaw, he stood by the frozen river and threw the key into the black water beneath the ice. It sank without sound. Still, as he turned to leave, the wind shifted. Faint and far behind him, a bell tolled once. Long Hollow, waiting. Spring finally broke the long grip of winter, but the thaw felt uneasy that year. Rivers swelled, roads softened, and the trees began to show the first hint of green, yet the air in the countryside carried a quiet weight that people did not speak of aloud. The village near the leper colony opened its market again. The children played in the fields, and travelers returned to the road, but a faint caution lingered in their glances when the path toward the old gates was mentioned. Life resumed, as it always does, but with a shadow lying just beneath its surface. Thomas had moved farther south by then, far from the cold fields and frost-heavy nights. Yet the story of the colony clung to him like a thin layer of ice that refused to melt. He spent months piecing together his notes, the old letters, the fragments of names and dates he had found. His journal became more than a record of strange nights. It became a map of silence, tracing how one forgotten name, Elias Brandt, had shaped the fears and choices of generations. He learned that the colony had been one of many across medieval Europe, places where the sick were sent not only for care, but also to be hidden from the world. In many cases, they were left to fend for themselves, surviving on meager rations and the mercy of nearby villages. But what had set this colony apart was the strange insistence, written in old council records, that it never be fully abandoned. Even after the sickness waned, the gates were repaired, the chapel kept standing, and the bell rope replaced when it rotted through. It was as though someone had decided that the place itself held something that should not be left open to the wind. The broken iron ring Thomas found beneath the chapel was mentioned in one last ledger. Seal in place. Do not remove. No explanation followed. As Thomas wrote his account, he began to see the shape of it more clearly. The villagers were not cruel for the sake of cruelty. They had lived with a story that never left them, and they had carried the burden of that silence because they believed it protected the world beyond. He realized, too, that his own part in the story was neither that of a hero nor a destroyer, but a reminder. The past does not remain still simply because we refuse to speak its name. He sent his work to a small press in the city, a modest book that spoke of medieval leper colonies, their hardships, their forgotten souls, and the strange weight of fear that shaped them. He did not embellish the story with ghosts or curses. He wrote what he saw, what he felt, and what the records could not quite hide. When readers asked if the figure in the chapel had been real, he would only say that history often leaves traces, and some traces linger longer than they should. Ellen never answered his letters, though once a parcel arrived with no return address. Inside was a strip of the old chapel cloth, frayed and brittle, and a note with 3 words, "The bell is silent." Whether it was relief or warning, Thomas could not tell. Years passed, and the memory of that winter softened like snow under the spring sun. The colony itself was eventually cleared. The chapel doors were sealed again, this time with stones rather than iron. A few travelers would still stop by, curious about the place mentioned in the book, but they would leave with little more than a cold wind on their backs, and the sense that the earth there held its breath a little longer than elsewhere. Thomas grew older, his hair touched with gray, his hands slower on the page. He no longer carried the key. Its weight had long since sunk to the bottom of the river, but he carried the lesson it had given him. That history is not only dates and names, but the lives of those who bore them, the fears they carried, and the choices they made to shield those they loved. Leper colonies in medieval Europe were not simply places of disease. They were landscapes of exile, resilience, and often forgotten humanity. Sometimes, on cold nights in early spring, he would think of that bell. He would remember the quiet faces in the village, the way they looked to the road as though waiting for something to pass. And he would wonder if the colony had truly been emptied, or if somewhere, beneath layers of soil and stone, the story still waited for another curious soul to lift the latch. But he no longer feared it as he once had. The fear had turned into something else, a respect for the unseen threads that tie past to present, and a reminder that not all mysteries demand an answer. Some are meant to keep their shape, to stand as quiet warnings in the fields, where the frost lies thickest and the wind carries the faintest sound of a bell long gone. In the end, Thomas chose to remember the faces more than the shadows, the children who peered from behind their mother's coats, the carpenter who lent him his courage for one cold night, the woman who gave him a key knowing it might change everything. They were the true heart of the story, not the stone walls or the dark stairs, but the people who lived in the echo of something old and still found a way to endure. And so, when his book was finally placed on a shelf in a quiet library, between thicker tomes of kings and wars, it carried more than a history of leper colonies. It carried a truth that lingers in every forgotten corner of the past, that even the most unsettling places are made not only of fear, but of the fragile, enduring lives that try to make peace with it.